The moment my father said it, I understood there wasn't anything left to discuss. Your brother owes $180,000. You're paying it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The way he said it made it sound settled, like the decision had already been made somewhere else, and this was just the part where I agreed. I sat there for a second, trying to make sense of how we had moved from dinner to that sentence so quickly. The food was still on the table, untouched. My coat was still on my shoulders, and if I don't, I asked. He looked at me directly. Then you're no longer our child. I already used my retirement to keep him afloat, he added, like that explained everything. My mother didn't say anything. She kept her hands folded in front of her and stared at the table, like she was waiting for it to pass. My name is Paige Holloway, 34 years old. I remember thinking that he expected me to hesitate, that there would be a pause where I tried to fix it or soften it or turn it into something else. Instead, I said, "Then I'm not." No one stopped me when I stood up. No one followed me to the door. I didn't slam it. I just left. Outside. The air felt colder than it had when I arrived, or maybe I was just noticing it more. I walked to my car and sat there for a minute before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just drove. The number stayed with me the whole time, $180,000. It didn't feel real, not in a way I could place anywhere in my life. For a moment, I considered calling my father back and asking what he expected me to do, just to hear it explained a different way. I didn't, but the thought stayed longer than I wanted. By the time I got home, I knew I needed to understand where it came from. I went inside, set my keys down, and called my bank. I asked them to review everything connected to my name, every account, every loan, anything that could explain what I had just been told. The person on the phone said they could start a review, but it might take time. I told them to begin anyway. I sat at my kitchen table after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular, trying to piece together what I might have missed. At that point, I still thought I was dealing with a debt, something defined, something that could be understood and handled if I looked at it closely enough. I thought it was about a number. I was wrong. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and pulled up my credit report, expecting to confirm one account and move on. Instead, I found myself scrolling more slowly than usual, reading each line twice, then a third time, trying to understand what I was looking at. The original loan was there, the one for $45,000 that I had co-signed a few years ago. I remembered the paperwork, the conversation, the way my father had framed it as temporary support. That part made sense. What didn't make sense was the balance. It wasn't just higher. It had been refinanced into something larger, something that didn't match what I had agreed to. I clicked into the details, but the information was limited, just enough to confirm that the original loan had been replaced by a new one under different terms. I kept going. That was when I saw the other accounts. A personal loan I didn't recognize. A line of credit opened less than a year ago, both tied to my name, both active, both carrying balances that added up faster than I was comfortable calculating. I leaned back slightly and went through the list again, this time writing everything down. Account numbers, dates, lenders, amounts. I needed to see it in one place. Some of the dates overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. One account appeared to have been opened within weeks of the refinance. Another showed activity that didn't match any transaction I remembered making. I called one of the lenders listed under the personal loan and waited through a few transfers before someone picked up who could access the file. I gave them my information, and they confirmed the account was active. The second lender didn't confirm anything. They told me the account existed, but refused to discuss details without written authorization. I explained I was the one listed on the account. They said that wasn't enough. I'd like to review the original application. I said, "We can provide that." They replied, "But you'll need to submit a formal request." That was the first moment something shifted. Up until then, I had been looking for an explanation I might have missed. Now I was being told there was a process, and that meant this wasn't something simple. I ended the call and went back to my notes, lining up the accounts in order of when they had been opened or changed. The numbers added up quickly once I stopped trying to make them smaller. When I finished, I didn't look at the screen again right away. I just sat there, holding the pen, going over the total in my head until it settled into something I couldn't ignore. $180,000. That number didn't come from one decision. I spent most of the next day on the phone, working through the list I had written down the night before, calling each lender one by one and documenting everything they were willing to tell me. Some conversations were straightforward, others weren't, and more than once I had to repeat the same explanation just to get past the first layer of questions. The refinance came up first. The lender confirmed that the original loan I had co-signed had been used to secure a larger one under updated terms. When I asked how that was possible without my direct involvement, there was a pause before the answer came. "You were already listed as a co-signer," the representative said. "That status carried over during the refinancing process." That didn't sit right, but it was enough to explain how my name had stayed attached to something bigger than I had agreed to. He had handled the paperwork the first time, and I hadn't thought much about how much of my information he had kept. The newer accounts were harder to pin down. One lender told me the application had been submitted online using my personal information, including my social security number and employment details. Another confirmed that the account had been verified through what they described as standard identity checks. "I'd like copies of the signed documents," I said. "We can provide those after a formal request," they replied, the same way the previous lender had. By the time I started receiving some of the documents electronically, I already knew what I was looking for. The signatures were close enough to mine to pass a quick glance, but they weren't consistent. The spacing was off, the flow different in small ways I recognized immediately. Still, not everything was clear. A few accounts were marked as under review, and some lenders needed more time before they could release full details. I couldn't resolve everything in a single day, no matter how many calls I made. I gathered what I had into a single timeline, placing each account where it belonged, watching the pattern form without needing anyone to explain it to me. This wasn't help. This was access. Once I had everything laid out in front of me, I stopped looking at it as one problem and started separating it into parts I could actually define. The original loan was the easiest place to begin because I remembered exactly when I signed it and why. It had been $45,000, and at the time, I had agreed to it without much hesitation because I thought I was helping my brother get through a temporary setback. That part was mine. I didn't try to reframe it or distance myself from it. I had signed the documents, and I understood what co-signing meant, even if I hadn't expected it to grow into something else later. What followed after that was different. The refinance had expanded the amount without my direct approval, and the additional accounts had been opened using my information in ways I had never authorized. When I looked at the timeline again, it was clear that those decisions had been made without me, even though my name had been used to support them. I called one of the lenders back to clarify the status of the refinanced loan. If I didn't approve the new terms, am I still responsible for the full amount I asked? "That depends on the outcome of the review," the representative said. "If unauthorized use is confirmed, your liability may be limited." It wasn't a confirmation, but it was enough to define the direction I needed to take. I drew a line in my notes, physically separating the accounts I had agreed to from the ones I hadn't. It wasn't just a legal distinction. It was the only way I could move forward without losing my footing in the process. I would take responsibility for what I agreed to, not what I didn't. After I separated the accounts and put everything into a timeline, I stopped looking at it as an isolated situation and started seeing it in the context of how things had always worked in my family. The numbers were new, but the structure wasn't. I had been the one people relied on for as long as I could remember. If something needed to be handled, I handled it. If something went wrong, I adjusted. It wasn't something anyone explained directly. It was just how things settled over time. My brother's role had been different when he made mistakes. There was always a way to soften the outcome, a way to buy time, a way to try again. No one said it out loud, but the expectations weren't the same. I remembered a conversation with my father from a few years back, after I had helped fix a situation that wasn't really mine to fix. "You always figure things out," he had told me. At the time, it sounded like confidence. Now it sounded like assumption. That was what had carried into that dinner. Not just the debt, but the belief that I would take it on because I always had before, even if the circumstances were different this time. I realized I hadn't questioned that pattern as much as I thought I had. Sitting there with everything laid out in front of me, I understood that this wasn't a one-time request that had gone too far. It was part of something that had been building for years without being addressed. This wasn't a one-time ask. It never had been. The next step wasn't complicated, but it required me to be precise. I called my bank again and placed a fraud alert on my accounts, then followed it by freezing my credit so nothing new could be opened without direct verification. The process took longer than I expected, mostly because every step required confirmation, and every confirmation required me to repeat the same details in a slightly different way. After that, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who handled financial disputes. Her office was on the second floor of a building downtown, quiet except for the sound of traffic outside. She didn't rush the conversation. Instead, she asked me to walk through everything in order. "Start with what you agreed to," she said, "and then show me where it changed." I handed over my notes, the timeline, and the documents I had gathered. She didn't give me answers right away. She circled parts of the timeline and said some of this would be hard to prove. "We'll need more than this," she said. "Right now. It's not clean. We'll need to request full documentation from each lender," she said. "And you'll have to file disputes individually. This won't resolve overnight." That part didn't surprise me, but hearing it said directly made it feel more structured than uncertain. Over the next day, I drafted formal letters to the lenders, outlining which accounts I disputed and why. I attached copies of the documents I had and kept records of everything I sent. It felt slower than I wanted, but also more solid than trying to argue it on my own. I also began preparing a report in case the situation needed to be escalated further, including the possibility of filing a formal fraud claim. By the time I finished, the situation no longer felt like something I had to explain to my family or defend in a conversation. Once it was documented, it stopped being personal. A few days after I sent the letters, the first visible shift happened, and it didn't come from anything I said. It came from the system responding to what had already been set in motion. One of the accounts tied to my brother missed an automatic payment after the credit freeze took effect. That triggered a review, and from what I later understood, the lender began verifying information connected to the account. One of those calls went to my parents' house. I didn't hear about it directly at first. What I noticed were the calls. My phone showed my father's name again and again, close together, closer than he usually called even when something was urgent. I let the first few go, not because I was avoiding it, but because I already knew what he would say. When I finally answered, there was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice wasn't raised, but it wasn't steady either. The certainty from that dinner was gone, replaced by something less controlled. I documented what I needed to. I said, "You can speak to my lawyer." There was another pause, longer this time. "This didn't have to go this far," he said. It had already gone further than he was willing to admit. I noticed he wasn't telling me what to do anymore. I ended the call after that. Not abruptly, just without extending it. The situation had shifted, and it was clear in ways that didn't need to be explained. The calls didn't stop after that, but they changed direction. It wasn't just my parents anymore. Messages started coming in from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, some of them careful, others more direct, all carrying the same message in different words. "Don't escalate this." One text read, "We can handle it ourselves." Another said, a few tried to soften it, asking how I was doing before shifting back to the same point, as if the tone mattered more than what they were asking me to do. I read them all and responded only when I had to. I didn't explain the situation again or try to correct their assumptions. That part had already been documented. "You can speak to my lawyer." I wrote back more than once, There wasn't much else to say. At some point, my mother called. I let it ring longer than usual before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I needed a moment to decide how much of the conversation I was willing to have. "We can fix this," she said quietly. "It's already being handled," I replied. I noticed she didn't say who he was anymore. The call ended without resolution, but that wasn't the point. I wasn't trying to resolve it through conversation anymore, and I wasn't going to step back into a system that only worked if I agreed to carry more than I should. 7 days after that dinner, there was a knock on my door that didn't sound like a delivery or a neighbor. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of knock that assumes you're already on the other side waiting. I opened it and found my parents standing there with my brother just behind them. No one spoke at first. They looked different than they had a week ago, not physically, but in the way they held themselves, like something had shifted and they weren't sure where they stood anymore. My brother was the first to say anything. "I thought I could fix it before you noticed," he said. "I wasn't trying to leave it on you. I just needed time." He didn't sound defensive. He sounded tired, like he had been repeating that explanation to himself more than to anyone else. I didn't interrupt him. There wasn't anything in what he said that changed what I already knew. "We knew some of it didn't look right," my mother said quietly, "but we thought it would settle before you saw it." My father stepped forward slightly, stopping just short of the doorway. "Tell us what you need," he said. "We'll take care of it." A week ago, he had told me what I was going to do. Now, he was asking. I kept my voice even. "The reports have already been filed." I said, "The accounts are under review, and the process has started. It doesn't stop because we're standing here talking about it." There was a pause, the kind that settles in when there's nothing left to argue against, only something to accept. My brother looked down, then back up again, like he was trying to find a version of this that ended differently. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said. It already had. I realized I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I looked at all three of them, at the space between where they stood and where I was, and understood that the distance wasn't just physical. "You already made your decision," I said. "Just not with me. You just didn't think I'd make mine." No one responded to that. There wasn't anything left to add that would change the direction things had taken. I stepped back and opened the door wider, not as an invitation but as a boundary I was choosing to define. It's too late. The process didn't resolve quickly, and it didn't unfold in a way that felt dramatic from the outside. It moved in steps, each one requiring documentation, verification, and time. Some accounts were removed after review, while others stayed in place until the details were confirmed. I followed through on the portion I had originally agreed to, the $45,000, and kept everything else separate. My brother entered an agreement that required him to repay part of what had been taken and accept legal consequences tied to how those accounts were opened. It wasn't a single moment of accountability, but a series of obligations that would stay with him for years. His credit was damaged, and the options available to him became limited in ways that couldn't be reversed quickly. My parents handled what remained. They didn't argue the same way anymore. There wasn't much left to argue about once the situation moved outside of them. Contact between us became occasional and careful. We spoke when necessary, but not the way we used to. The expectations that had shaped those conversations weren't there anymore. I noticed the silence felt different when it wasn't something I was trying to fix. Most mornings settled into something steady. I would sit at the table with my coffee. No calls coming in, no decisions waiting to be made for someone else. It wasn't a new life. It was just one that felt like it belonged to me. It took me longer than I expected to understand that responsibility only works when it's chosen, not assigned under pressure. Once you understand that, it becomes easier to see where you stand, even when it costs something. I didn't lose my family that week. I stopped carrying what they wouldn't. One morning, I picked up my phone out of habit, expecting to see missed calls or messages waiting for me to respond. There was nothing there. I set it back down and didn't pick it up again for a while.